States. History, song, and tradition have each done something to perpetuate the reconciliation or the recollection of the deeds of one whose name has come to us linked with all that is cruel and rapacious in a war of the most fratricidal character. But no authentic, detailed account of his life has up to the present time been made public, and but few of the particulars of his career during the war are generally known. All who have written of David Fanning, the Tory, have assigned him a high rank in the annals of infamy, and none who read his own account of himself and his services will hesitate to admit that he has been, by merit, raised to that bad eminence. The frankness with which he narrates his adventures and speaks of the cold-blooded murder of his neighbors and fellow citizens is only equaled by the self-satisfaction which he exhibits at the close of his address to the reader, in using the words of the psalmist as applicable to himself as the perfect and upright man. So we'll take quickly here to his words to we the readers. Courteous reader, whoever thou art, the author being only a farmer bred and not conversant in learning, thou mayest think that the within journal is not authentic, but it may be depended upon on that every particular herein mentioned is nothing but the truth. Yea, I can boldly assert that I have undergone much more than what is herein mentioned. Rebellion, according to Scripture, is as the sin of witchcraft, and the propagators thereof has more than once punished, which is dreadfully exemplified this day in the now United States of America, but formerly provinces. For since their independence from Great Britain, they have been awfully and visibly punished by the fruits of the earth being cut off, and civil dissension in every day prevailing among them. Their fair trade and commerce almost totally ruined, and nothing prospering so much as nefarious and rebellious smuggling. Whatever imperfection is in the within, it is hoped will be kindly overlooked by the courteous reader and attributed to the author's want of learning. I do not set forth anything as a matter of amusement, but what is really justly fact, that my transactions and scenes of life have been as herein narrated during the term of the rebellion, and that conduct, resolution, and courage perform wondrous things beyond credibility, the following of which laudable deeds will give them are exercised therein the experience that I have gained. In the 19th year of my age, I entered into the war and proceeded from one step to another as herein mentioned, and at the conclusion thereof was forced to leave the place of my nativity for my adherence to the British Constitution. After my sore fatigues, I arrived at St. John River, and there, with the blessing of God, I have hitherto enjoyed the sweets of peace and freedom under the benevolent auspices of the British government, which every loyal and true subject may enjoy with me, is the wish of the author, David Fanning. So he has some differing views on his activity within our county than we'll see here a bit later on. He thinks that everything he did was in defense of the crown and the rule of law under the British. But looking here, we see David Fanning was born in 1755, and according to his will, that was in Beach Swamp Settlement in Amelia County, Virginia. It's just southwest of Richmond today. And his father was David Fanning Sr. We don't have much information on his father or mother, but we get the information on his father from the orphan records in the county court records in North Carolina once he arrives here with his sister Elizabeth, because they are both will be bound out in service as apprentices, as we'll see here in a moment. But in 1782, he marries Sarah Carr, a 16-year-old, and they have 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons. And Fanning would die in 1825 in Digby, Nova Scotia, in Canada. And I promise I'm not going to read too much tonight, but so much of it comes at the beginning from his accounts. And I just think that this is another interesting look into the mind of David Fanning in his own description of his marriage. I concluded within myself that it was better for me to try and settle myself, being weary of the disagreeable mode of living I had borne with for some considerable time. For the many kindnesses and the civility of a gentleman who lived in the settlement of Deep River, I was induced to pay my addresses to his daughter, a young lady of 16 years of age. The day of marriage being appointed, on making it known to my people, Captain William Hooker and Captain William Carr agreed to be married with me. They both left me to make themselves and their intended wives ready. The day before we were to be coupled, the rebels, before mentioned, with those good horses, attacked us, Captain Hooker's horse being tied so fast he could not get him loose, and they caught him and murdered him on the spot. Myself and Captain Carr were married and kept 2 days' merriment. The rebels thought they were sure of me then. However, I took my wife and concealed her in the woods with Captain Carr's. So I just think that that's such an interesting picture of the mind of David Fanning. Here is one of his top men that's supposed to be married with him on this 3 weddings in one day, killed, and he takes no time to mourn this friend of his. He and his other friend are married and keep 2 days' merriment, so they just go on about life, I guess. Such was life for him. David Fanning's early life, he, like I said, was born in Virginia, and his father likely came to North Carolina to make arrangements for the family to move, because he purchased land in in Johnson County, but drowned, I guess, on his return trip to Virginia in Orange County on Deep River, which today could be Chatham or Randolph counties, for the area that Deep River goes through, what was then Orange. And you see on the map there, Johnson County is just here in what is today Wake County. We know that by 1764, Fanning's mother had died because he and his sister both appear in the court records in Johnson County to be bound as apprentices under 2 different individuals. They go their separate ways. And David was first bound in January of 1764 to a Thomas Leach, and his sister Elizabeth to a Benjamin Shuttleworth. But then later that same year, in July 1764 at court, David shows up again and is this time bound to a very prominent individual in Johnston County who was a justice of the peace named Needham Bryan Jr. And I found this was interesting in those records. You don't see this all the time, but to teach him to read and write was explicit in the order of the court in assigning him. So maybe he couldn't last long under the previous individual he had been bound as apprentice to, or maybe there was some promise seen in him, and so he needed a more prominent individual who could teach him to read and write. But we know that during his time with Needham Bryan Jr., he became a skilled horseman and was noted for that throughout the rest of his life. But at 15 or 16 years of age, he was actually called up into the militia to serve in the War of the Regulators that met at Alamance. He did not like the Bryans very much, and said that they treated him very ill, and while he was under their care, he developed something that they called in those days the scald head, and they think it's probably from something tetterworm or some other skin condition that they thought was a worm. But basically, because of this, he eventually runs away and goes to stay with John O'Daniels and his family, the wife of whom heals him of this condition. But for the rest of his life, he would be left bald, and he wore a head covering to cover up the scars from that. Eventually, he moves to the 96th District of South Carolina, where he takes up trading with the Cherokee, becomes fairly prosperous there. But while returning from a trading expedition in 1775, he recounts that he is ambushed by what he believes is a party of Whigs, and it's at that moment that he aligns himself with the Tories, with the British cause. again, like I said, we're not going to go into everything about Fanning. Those will be for other presentations. But this is something that I think must be mentioned just to understand the daring of this individual. And he, at times, seemed scared of some things and at other times scared of nothing. But he carried out a raid in 1781 in Hillsborough, where much of the North Carolina government was at that time. At that time, the state capital moved around. They would meet in different locations throughout the state. But at that time, most of the state government happened to be in Hillsborough, and he captured the governor, Thomas Burke, along with him taking some 200 other prisoners, and they surprised them at daybreak, and before an alarm could be sounded, and essentially no one was armed. They captured all of these individuals and marched them to Wilmington, where the British were in control, to be held prisoner. And while he's on this march, he's pursued by General John Butler, who confronts him the next day at the Battle of Lindley's Mill, which lasted nearly 4 hours. But Butler was eventually forced from his position, and Fanning was able to get the prisoners to Wilmington, where our governor remained a prisoner, actually on James Island, South Carolina, until he made his escape in January of the next year. So, we have a picture of Fanning. Now let's look at the Randolph County of their day. Randolph County, as many of you present probably know, was founded in 1779. This was by an act of the General Assembly to divide the county of Guilford into 2 separate counties at the petition of individuals living in the southern part of then Guilford for their own county in Randolph. The county was named for Peyton Randolph, the first president of the Continental Congress, who was from a prominent, probably the most prominent landowner family in Virginia. But the Act of the Assembly passes in January of 1779 and states that our counties to be formed, gives the dividing lines, and that at the house of Abraham Reese on the 2nd day of March this same year, court is to be held. And to be held there or at whichever place the justices think convenient until a courthouse, stock, and prisons can be built. I just think it's fascinating. The individuals of this day had a much closer relationship, and probably out of necessity, to their government than we do today. All of them participated, and I don't know, I think it will be hard for anyone in this room to imagine being told, stand up a county government, you know, we've just passed this act, and go stand it up and assign all these positions and you know, make everything function, and they get to work right away. And these are the minutes from the March session, and they're appointing individuals. And it's also interesting as well to think about this oath of allegiance that keeps getting mentioned, that they have to take this oath of allegiance because this government is being set up by North Carolina in a state of rebellion against the crown. And so, not to say that this is the same as signing the Declaration of Independence, but certainly all of these individuals, by aligning themselves with what was seen as the government in rebellion, were putting themselves at risk, as we will see on Fanning's Bloody Sabbath. By September of that year, they've already completed their tax lists, and you know, it's just pretty incredible that they set out right away to get all of these things that they're supposed to do as a county government done. They assign the county into districts, and a lot of this would have been replicated from the county that existed before, Guilford, and even before that, Rowan and Orange. So they knew how to do these things, but again, here they are responsible doing it for the first time themselves. And we see here within the tax list that is returned, persons that have not taken the oath of allegiance and returned inventories of their taxable property. So these are individuals that refused, either because there could be two reasons. Either because they are loyalists to the crown, or Quakers, as we'll see in a moment. So there was an issue among the Quakers with taking oaths, and so these were individuals who chose not to participate. And in fact, just saying it now, Ross and I were talking earlier about Abraham Haskett. He's the first name on that list, who was a Quaker that Haskett Creek is named for. So this is from the 1790 census, just to give an idea of what our county looked like at the time. Of course, this is a few years later, so we can assume there's probably been some growth, particularly following the war. But this would have been roughly the population of the county at the time. 70 to almost 7,300 persons. They have these distinctions, as you'll see. This carries on for a number of years between free white males ages 16 and older and those under 16 years of age. And part of that was identifying those persons who were of the age to serve in the militia. So how many individuals did they have of an age that could be called up to militia service if necessary? And just interesting to note that there were 452 enslaved persons in the county at that time, but compared to many other counties, much smaller. If you see Chatham and Wake there, a much smaller enslaved population. And now the political landscape of that day. So we're going to see throughout this, and if you delve into this period of history, you'll see this over and over, Whigs and Tories. Those were the terms they use today, like we might use, I guess, Republican or Democrat. But in that day, the Whigs would have called themselves patriots. I don't know if the Tories would have called them a patriot. They would have probably referred to them as rebels. But these were, sorry?
They did.
Yeah, rebels. So in the United Kingdom, these were individuals who did support the constitutional monarchy, but they wanted a stronger role for Parliament and seeking social reforms for all of society, whereas your Tories or the Loyalists at that point in the UK served more of the interest of the gentry. So the Tories would have called themselves Loyalists. This is a map that we'll see over and over, so I attribute this appropriately. Mac Watley did this back in, I think, the 1780s, you said?
No. 1970.
Oh, sorry. My mind's in the 1700s right now, folks. The 1970s. Not good. So it's an interesting map because I like using this map within this time frame because this would have been their world. If you use a modern map that has roads going everywhere, there were certainly roads at this time, but nowhere near what we have today. And you'll see this throughout their deeds, and even the way that if they describe how they're traveling, they're always referencing creeks and rivers. So this is the map that we'll see throughout. But basically, I put this together with a general idea, the blue being the Whigs, the red being the Tories or Loyalists, as a rough estimation based on a letter from General Alexander Gray to E.W. Carruthers, Reverend E.W. Carruthers, who wrote a 2-volume set that probably does more for the history of the Revolution than anyone else of that or later periods. Revolutionary Incidents, and it's in 2 volumes. But he was going about to collect information about the incidents of the Revolution in North Carolina. And so here we have this letter. I removed to Randolph Courthouse in immediate vicinity of which Mrs. Bell, the most of the Whigs of that county who had taken part in the war resided. Those who lived in the south and eastern parts of the county were mostly Tories under the control of Colonel Fanning, or remained neutral from fear of him. So this is to give a general idea of the basis of operation. David Fanning made his camp for most of this period at Cox's Mill, which would have been down below Franklinville area, on Deep River, where Millstone Creek runs in, and on the other side, Mill Creek, in that vicinity. And then Johnsonville, though it wasn't called that at the time, it would eventually become Johnsonville, our first county seat, was up here, just east, slightly southeast of modern-day Randolph, not far from Deep River, but located at the crossroads of the two major roads that would have gone through this area. So here we see some descriptions that I think are interesting, and we'll see one that goes the other way a little bit later on. But this is to give an idea of what folks were encountering in a letter from Lord Cornwallis to the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord Germain. The hope was that our friends in North Carolina, who were said to be very numerous, would make good their promises of assembling and taking an active part with us in endeavoring to reestablish His Majesty's government. Our experience has shown that their numbers were not so great as had been represented, and that their friendship was only passive. For we have received little assistance from them since our arrival in the province. And this is being written really just after he's had his incident at Guilford Courthouse, and he's making his way towards Wilmington and encountering folks in our area. As we know, he traveled along Deep River as well as other parts of the state. But then Carruthers, who wrote Revolutionary Incidents, his commentary on this letter is, every son of the Old North State will be pleased to learn that there were not half, probably not a tenth part as many real Tories in it, the state, as has been represented. So just keep that in mind, as we'll see later from Collier, who takes a different opinion. That he says that maybe a tenth part were Tories. And then we have another group to contend with that maybe don't fit the description of Tory or Whig, although not true in every case. But I call them the questionable Quakers. I grew up at Marlboro Friends, and so several of the individuals mentioned throughout this story are ancestors of mine. But the Quakers had an issue with the oaths of allegiance, these tests of fidelity. And in May of 1777, the General Assembly passes a law requiring these tests, these oaths be implemented and comply by May of 1779. We're a county 1779, so certainly applicable to us. But then they receive some backlash, allow them instead to pay a threefold tax as for the Quakers if they don't want to take this oath. And so, if anyone in the room is Quaker, but I think in classic Quaker fashion, the yearly meeting at the time issues advice, and that members take a close and solid consideration whether the payment of taxes under the present commotions be consistent with our peaceable principles. So, not do this or don't do this, just let you decide. What can your conscience abide by? And now we'll move to those events of March in 1782, his bloody Sabbath. And as we go through this story, these will be the main sources for this narrative as I'm telling it. We have Colonel David Fanning from his own narrative. Isaac Farlow is a prominent one. He was a young, probably a boy, young man at the time of these incidents, and recounts many of them to George C. Mendenhall, and also Carruthers receives information from him, and then Carruthers takes as his sources George Mendenhall, a prominent attorney from Guilford County, General Alexander Gray, prominent individual from the northern part of Randolph, and then Miss Margaret Balfour, the sister of Colonel Andrew Balfour, and also letters that he collects through the years. So the incidents of that March day in 1782 start with Colonel Andrew Balfour, and as we go through this, these will be added and you'll see the flashing spot marking the rough location based on my research of these. Some of them more accurate. This one's fairly accurate because that's where his, the Balfour gravesite is today, so we know that. Yes?
Excuse me, Matt. Whereabouts on that map is Ashboro? And
Uh,
how did it start?
Ashboro is going to be right about here. So here's Abrams Branch and Haskett's Creek. So that's just north Ashboro there. So Ashboro right about in this area.
So there wasn't much there at this time.
There is nothing in Ashboro at this time. Ashboro was a wolf thicket. It was the wolf thicket.
When did
And-
it start?
Ashboro was 1796, correct? 1796, Ashboro became the county seat at the petition of individuals within the county because this was the county seat. At the time they were instructed, near Randleman, it's actually, if anyone knows, Brown's Crossroads is what that area was called. But it's where the Moravian Road and the Native American trading paths crossed, and those were two of the oldest roads through our area. But at the time of the formation of the county, they were instructed to move the county seat to the center, to find the center, and they never did so. And so later there are petitions in the state legislature. If you read the legislation, it's one that they're sort of chastising these individuals, and they appoint entirely different commissioners to find the center, to move it there, as they were supposed to have done in the first place. But we have Colonel Andrew Balfour, who was born 1736 in Scotland. He owned a nearly 2,000 acre plantation in the southwest portion of Randolph County. He served twice for the county, so they had annual elections, and the legislature set once a year. Well, and sometimes they would sit multiple times a year, or they would have a session that came for multiple sittings. But anyways, he was elected twice by the county to serve in 1780 and 1781. Initially a second major in the county militia, eventually becoming a colonel. And he was sitting at home, as we'll see here in just a minute, told by Margaret Balfour in a letter to her sister-in-law, but was shot in the shoulder reading his Bible. And then Fanning came up on the porch and put a bullet through his head. So we read here, we're not reading the whole thing, we're read an excerpt from this, but this is in September of this year. So basically, as a result of this, the Balfours kind of lose everything, and the estate is in disarray. And so if you read the full letter, Margaret's sort of writing this to her sister-in-law in a fairly distressed tone. But on the 10th of March, about 25 armed ruffians came to the house with the intention to kill my brother. Tibby and I endeavored to prevent them, but it was all in vain. The wretches cut and bruised us both a great deal, and dragged us from the dear man then before our eyes. The worthless, base, horrible Fanning shot a bullet into his head, which soon put a period to the life of the best of men, the most affectionate and dutiful husband, father, son, and brother. The sight was so shocking that it is impossible for tongue to express anything like our feelings. But the barbarians, not in the least touched with our anguish, drove us out of the house and took everything that they could carry off, except the Negroes, who happened to be all from the home at that time. It being Sunday, never were creatures in more distress. We were left in a strange county, naked, without money, and what was 1,000 times worse, we had lost forever a near and dear relation. What added to our affliction was the thought of his poor, helpless family left destitute, and it was not in our power to assist them. I think she's speaking of the general state of the whole family. Because his wife is still up north. She had not made arrangements to come down with him yet, to live in Randolph County. He had come to start the plantation. And where she's writing this from is, I think it's about 24 miles from where Colonel Balfour's plantation was. And so that's what she's saying, she's in a strange county. And basically just ran as far as they could until they found someone who would take them in. But everything was destroyed. Not satisfied with his deeds, David Fanning and his crew travel up Back Creek to the home of, this is one of my ancestors, William Milliken, who was born in northern Iowa in around 1720, and came to then Rowan County in the 1750s or late 1750s or early 1760s, and know that he served as a justice of peace in Randolph County. He was both a surveyor and a farmer, and served as Randolph's first county register of deeds. But as was common in that time, if you were, or it was just sort of understood, if you were not at home, Fanning would burn your home, but if you were found at home, he would spare your home but take your life, if you were on his list of those Whigs he was after. And so most of these individuals, particularly the ones who aren't serving in a militia capacity, are not at home as these events unfold. And so he sets fire to the house and barns, and there's a story of his wife trying to throw out a feather bed to save it, and Fanning's men throwing it back onto the flames and watching the feathers float up burning and laughing, telling her what a fool she was because one of the flames comes down and lands in her knitting basket and burns it all up as well. But then they force his son, Benjamin Milliken, and another boy, Joshua Lowe, to pilot them to Colonel Collier's. And this we'll see a few times that he has to have a guide because, or find the way. This area of the county that he's about to commit all these deeds in is the strongest Whig part of the county, so not an area he's traveled through probably all that often. And so they are forced to guide him to the home of John Collier. And I say not Collins because I think this is one thing that Carruthers maybe gets wrong, that he thinks that there are two individuals, and it's probably in the letters that he's being written in a spelling error that someone's called Collier Collins. But if we look at all the other source material, and if you go through the land records of the day, there are no Collins in that part of the county referenced, and I think it's just he's putting the same story together because almost the same thing takes place for this. But anyways, we see that they're guided to Colonel John Collier's. Collier is a very prominent individual. He had, while we were part of Guilford County, served in the House of Commons in 1777, and then was our senator in the Senate from 1779, our formation, and he actually did not seek re-election. He sort of retired a bit from public life for a while after the 1782 term. He wasn't universally admired. He was, as Isaac Farlow tells, that he sort of stole land from people where they didn't have entries or they were behind on something. And Isaac Farlow says he made his father pay a fat steer to get the title to their property back. But certainly a prominent individual and did quite a lot for the county. He served as the colonel for the county, so he was the head of the militia throughout the Revolutionary period. And he had placed a young man, Benjamin Fincher, as sentinel, and because I guess word got out that Fanning was moving through the area. And as Fanning is approaching, he forces Benjamin Milliken and Joshua Lowe to hail Benjamin Fincher to say that they are friends. And so we're friends as they approach, because he says, show yourself, or announce yourself. And as they get closer, he's still trying to figure out who they are. They shoot at Benjamin Fincher, and the story is that Fincher's, as Isaac Farlow tells it, his vest was tied or wrapped around him so tight that the bullets, at whatever distance it was, hit it and bounced off. And he took off running, but those gunshots alerted Collier, who is quoted as shouting, "Parade, parade, boys, parade," and had kept a horse tied out his back, and he took off, made his escape. But also I should have explained on my map, the cross symbols stand for where someone's killed, and this is where a house is set ablaze. So his house was likely somewhere around the Beeson Farm Road area. I have varying conflicting stories from locals about its exact location, but from the land record research that I've done, that seems to be the area that he lived in. And then they leave his house. Also, there's part of the story. Benjamin Milliken, Joshua Lowe. While all this is taking place, they find a pen full of cattle near his barns and sneak into it and make their escape through the cows, using them as cover to get away from Fanning and his men while all this is happening. But then Fanning, no longer having a guide, as they've escaped, has to seek some help to find the next place. But I think this is a letter from Collier, who would have been head of the militia at the time and our senator, writing to Governor Burke in February of 1782, so a month before, not even a month before these activities take place. Just take a bit. "The county is still very much infested with a set of villains led by Fanning and one Walker, who, having rendered themselves desperate by the atrocity of their crimes, mounted upon the best of horses, well armed and harbored and secreted by many of the inhabitants upon the waters of deep and little rivers, murder and rob with great impunity." And he goes on to say a number of other things, but I hope your excellency will pardon the length and minuteness of this letter as nothing but a deep sense of my duty in the distressed situation of this county could have induced me to trouble you with this detail. So the residents know that something's got to be done about this Fanning, and it's too little too late for many of those individuals affected by his bloody Sabbath. So he's trying to make his way to John Bryant's house, who is captain in the militia, but he loses his way. He's not familiar with the area, and it's night at this point in time. And so he comes across a house inhabited by two younger girls, Betsy and Elsie Harlan, daughters of Stephen Harlan, who was a Quaker. But he worked for Fanning's number 2 guy, Captain Stephen Walker, who owned a mill, and he was his miller. And so they treat the girls a little more kindly after they find that out, because Walker says so. That's his miller. But they ask them to tell the way to different houses, and then eventually say, "You're going to come with us and show us the way." And so they force them to escort them to Colonel Bryant's. And they don't miss this. They didn't miss his house by much, because it's not very far to our next location, just there. And this is all sort of the Beeson Farm Road, between Beeson Farm and Marlboro Church Road area that this is taking place. And in Sophia. And they come to Captain John Bryant's. He was born about 1750 in North Carolina. He was serving as deputy sheriff under William Bell, as a county tax collector, and as a captain. So Fanning approaches and says if he will come out and take a parole, basically be taken prisoner, but I think he figured that was probably not in the cards for him, as he had already taken a parole and was in violation of it. He said that he would spare the house and his family. But he says, "Damn you and your parole too. I've had one and I will never take another." And so then Fanning's trying to figure out what to do, and forces the Harlan sisters to go up on the porch and entreat with him, do some negotiating. And he doesn't know, but there's some of Fanning's men standing just behind them, and he opens the door a little bit to surrender and step out. But as he does, he was shot down, falling back into his wife's arms, and Yeah, it says his wife raised him little as he fell. Then Fanning, another one of Fanning's party, steps forward and puts a bullet to his head. So he gets the same treatment as we saw with Balfour. And then this is an interesting detail in the recounting of this by Isaac Farlow, who would have lived in this very same neighborhood. That Fanning curled up into a cradle and took a nap. Rocked himself for a while and slept. And then waking to continue on his journey, leaves in search of Dugan's house. But it would be Isaac Farlow's parents, Nathan and Ruth Farlow, who they come and lay out the body of Bryant, and that's when Isaac, as a young boy, he saw the corpse laid out that next morning. Also, interesting things you find when you read through the court minutes. John Bryant's son, John Bryant Jr., was appointed in 1779 as the county coroner. So just, I don't know, sort of an interesting tidbit that I guess he would have had to come and examine the body of his father. But here we have the letter referenced earlier, John Collier writing to his father about a month after this atrocity, and recounts, take a bit here, my wife Margaret called out to cease their firing, and she would open the door and let them in, for there was no person there but women and children. They rushed into the house, set fire to it, and burned it to ashes, with article that was in it, but some few articles that my oldest daughter Martha threw out the door. They left my house and killed one of my captains, John Bryant, 1 mile from my house. They went to Aunt Mary Dugan's, burned the house and barn. They killed Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Balfour of our county on the same day they burned my house. And this is where he says it in closing. I believe that 9/10 of our county are enemies to the United States of America. So you have Carruthers saying that we can be proud that not 1/10 are enemies, but Collier after this is just not convinced by his friends and neighbors that they're truly committed to the cause. It's believed that while he's trying to make his way to Dugan's, he gets lost again, being unfamiliar with the area, and ends up approaching the home of William and Martha Bell, which would have been just beside the Bell's Mill, where Muddy Creek and Deep River come together. It's now under Randolph Lake. William Bell was the first sheriff, a very prominent landowner, and he married Martha McFarland McGee, who was a widow of John McGee, one of the wealthiest individuals in Orange County at the time. So these were two very wealthy individuals marrying each other, very influential in the community. But the story goes that when Fanning and his men arrived, William not at home like many of the other men throughout this, but that Martha had several young men about to defend their home, and yells out in the voice of a stentor to throw open the windows, take good aim, and not to draw a trigger until they were sure to take down a man. And this voice of a stentor is referenced by both Carruthers and Alexander Gray in writing a newspaper article later. Is from Homer's Iliad. It's like a herald type creature that has the voice of 50 men. So she was bellowing out and apparently known for this. But that Fanning took fright from that. He had a bad experience at House in the Horseshoe. He didn't like approaching houses that he wasn't sure of who was truly in, that might be shooting back at him, and just decides to burn their barn and goes back to Bryant's to try to figure out the correct way to Colonel Thomas Dugan's. And while he's making he goes back to Bryant's, finds the way, and court was to be held this week. So it's now Monday, morning. And Fanning recounts in his own narrative that he stops there at the courthouse for a while and prevented their doing anything there that day. And we know from a transcription project of those early minutes that no minutes exist for March of 1782, so he did something, and they were supposed to hold elections. Those didn't happen. But Colonel Thomas Dugan was born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 1740s. He would die in 1795 in Randolph County. It's said because he had been captured before and spent a lot of his time on a prison ship outside of Wilmington, that the diseases he suffered on that ship kept him in poor health for the rest of his life. But he did, when the British evacuation took place, he was released 1781 and would go on to serve 4 terms in the NC Senate for Randolph. And then his land would eventually go on to be sold to become the town of Johnsonville, which would become the county seat. But his house and barns were burned, and likely those of his parents because of what's mentioned in the Collier letter. And there was some relation between the Colliers and the Dugans. And so his mother, Mary, is mentioned. And that's about where that would have been. Down on Deep River in the area of where Polecat Creek comes into Deep River, so approaching Worthville area. And really just further along the road. And after that, they've got to take a rest. They've had a night and day full of activity. At this point, they've murdered 2 people and burnt at least 4 properties, maybe 5. And they spend the night with this man, Brown Franklin, who was a loyalist, gave refuge to them. And we read, according to General Gray, Fanning and his men went 2 miles further to the house of one Franklin, who was said to be a Tory, refreshed themselves and horses, and started early in the morning, but not before the Whigs came in sight on the opposite side of Deep River. And it's said that 300 light horse came in pursuit of Fanning and his men, that by this point the alarm had been raised, word had spread to other counties, they assembled a light horse unit to come and pursue him. And also was in Crothers that as they fled, Franklin, being at the back, was shot down by one of the Whigs. So I guess that's what he got for harboring Fanning. But then on their way back to Cox's Mill, along the road, it's recounted that Fanning and his men encounter someone he recognizes. It's not quite clear who this was. There's varying identities given, but Fanning gives in his own account that he catched a commissary from Salisbury who had some of my men prisoners and almost perished him and wanted to hang some of them. I carried him to a certain tree and they immediately hung him. And that tree was a tree where previously some Tories had been hung. And he said that before the war was over, he would hang his 5 men for every Tory hung on that tree. He didn't have his wish granted, but later there's a letter written by Absalom Tatum, another prominent individual from Randolph, that gives the name as a Mr. King, so it might have been him. But like I said just before, a Tory had been hung named Isaac Jackson from the limb of a nearby tree, and Isaac Farlow says he knows the place of both trees, that Fanning got it wrong. It wasn't the same tree, because he knew the limb on both as a young boy. So the light horse arrive and he takes off. Oops. And as referenced, Absalom Tatum, this is another very prominent individual. He was born in Eastern North Carolina, but comes to Randolph and is here at our founding. He's elected the first clerk of court, but also elected to serve in the House of Commons. And there were some issues covered, we can cover another time with that. You couldn't hold 2 offices. But he eventually goes to Hillsborough, is named Surveyor of North Carolina, 1785 by the Continental Congress, and then serves as a delegate in the Constitutional to consider ratification of the Constitution, and becomes a member of Congress. But he writes this letter to Governor Burke just days after this incident was taking place. So, sir, on Sunday, the 11th instant, Colonel Balfour of Randolph was by Fanning and his party, also a Captain Bryant and a Mr. King, were murdered in the night of the same day by them. Colonel Collier's and 2 other houses were burned by the same party. Colonel Balfour's sister and daughters and several other women were wounded and abused in a barbarous manner. These, sir, are facts. I was at that time in Randolph, saw the Tories and some of their cruelties. Without a speedy relief, the good people of that county must leave their habitations and seek refuge in some other place. So he wants the governor to know that something's got to be done. And this, here we have just the aftermath of the events of that day. This is Carruthers' commentary on that letter we just read. About the time that foregoing letter was written, and for some weeks after, a state of suffering and distress existed in Randolph County, especially in the upper parts of it, which can hardly be conceived. Many of the most respectable men in the county, prominent Whigs who had been active in the cause, and a number of peaceable and inoffensive men who had taken no active part on either side, were murdered in the most shocking manner. Houses and barns were burned with everything they contained. Provisions, bedding, and comforts of every kind were destroyed, and many families, hitherto in affluent circumstances, were left in beggary or absolute starvation. And while we take the name Fanning's Bloody Sabbath, this comes from that article by General Gray in a Salisbury newspaper in 1847. This was the greatest Sabbath day work Fanning ever did in Randolph. He committed 2 murders, burnt 3 houses, 1 barn, and was so much alarmed by the commands given by an old woman, Mrs. Bell, that he and his troops fled in haste. So after all of these evil deeds are done, and the war is over, just to give a picture of what the state of North Carolina thought of this individual, David Fanning, for all these ills and the many others he had done. In 1783, after the war, the General Assembly passes what is called the Act of Pardon and Oblivion, and it's to forgive all crimes or service on the side of the British and allow individuals remaining in the state to be restored to good standing. But provided further that nothing herein contained shall extend to pardon Peter Mallet, David Fanning, and Samuel Andrews, or any person or persons guilty of deliberate and willful murder, robbery, rape, or house burning, or any of them, anything herein contained to the contrary notwithstanding. So he's called out by name and exempted from being pardoned. And Fanning would go on to escape through Charleston, board a ship to Florida, where the British loyalists were being evacuated to as the war came to its close. And then basically many of them in Florida were given the option where they would go, and he chose to go to Nova Scotia in Canada.
He lost a lot of his possessions too, didn't he?
Yes, and that's what...
His home and
Yeah.
his favorite horse. That horse meant more to him than his life.
Yeah, so the horse, Baydoe, which was his favorite horse, was stolen by Andrew Hunter.
He tried
And he
to
never
get
got it back.
but he never did.
Uh,
Get her back.
And that's what his narrative really would encourage anyone who's interested in the topic to find his narrative and read it. I think it's available entirely online for free, and I'm sure there are copies here at the library. But his narrative is really written by him as an account to the British in order to try to get compensation, because that's what they were promised in taking up arms for the crown, and he felt he was never appropriately compensated. And so he spent many years writing letters, paying for an attorney in London to, submit his pleas to be reimbursed for all that he had lost, and made many many an accounting of all that he had lost during his time in North Carolina.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes.
Would you agree or disagree that war is two-sided?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Repeat the
This
question.
is-
So she asked if I would agree or disagree whether war is two-sided.
Okay. The Patriots also murdered and burned
Oh, yes,
homes
yeah,
that were allies to David Fanning.
yes.
And so I have done research on this as well, and it's one side, it's a good read. But I think David Fanning's relatives still reside in Randolph County, some of them.
Oh, wow.
But no, it really does, it gives a one-sided situation.
Yeah, yeah. I guess,
It's still a good read
yeah,
though.
maybe the victors write the history
Yeah.
in some sense. But yeah, certainly there were atrocities committed by both
Right,
sides,
on both
absolutely,
sides. That's always
of the
the
war.
case.
No,
Yeah.
no. But, yeah, I guess for our area, he was seen as especially
Yeah.
villainous.
I have another question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I've talked to Ross about this. Have you ever been to any of the areas where Fanning used as a campsite or a hideout?
I've never been to the exact spots, but driven by them, yeah.
I wouldn't recommend it as a weekend retreat. I wouldn't.
No.
They're in, I've been to two of them and stayed all night. One was also used as an infirmary where they had a smallpox epidemic.
Mhm.
But we were in a group of 18 backpackers and 18 people, and all the money in Randolph County could not make me stay there again.
Yeah.
No. I have been during the day. I have been back during the day, but I made sure I could get out before night. It was not a good experience. We had 8 people left at the break of day the next day, and it was 5 miles from the nearest house.
Oh, my
Without breakfast, no. It was a bad experience, and it was in Montgomery.
goodness. Okay, yeah. Thank you. Any- good.
What strikes me about this, and I just looked it up, Jamestown was in July of '81. So all this stuff was going on after basically the war was over.
Correct, yeah. It's very, I guess their attention was elsewhere, but the war is coming to a close, particularly, I mean, the British have already by this point abandoned Wilmington. I mean, they have no operations really in Randolph County, and he's just sort of operating in the backcountry, continuing to carry out his deeds.
I read it recently described as, today we see Yorktown as the defeat, but the Loyalists at the time saw it and the British as a defeat until time went on and it began to dawn on everyone that yeah, this was the defeat.
Yeah. Yep.
How did Fanning expect to get his property back if the Americans had already won the war? How could he have done it through the British?
So after this period, I mean, there were all sorts of claims going on and people getting their, like this act of pardon oblivion doing, and questions around the seizure of Tory property because a lot of that was taking place in the latter years of the war. And so I think he was expecting it maybe to play out in some sort of legal format, but and not that he would necessarily get his exact property back, but that he would be compensated by the British for the value of the
And I
things
don't think
he
he
lost.
ever won.
No, he was not. No, correct. Yeah, never received compensation.
This was more like a feud than a war. I mean, it sounds like to me.
I mean, so much of this in the, and I guess there could have been other places somewhat like this, but I think the Piedmont of North Carolina was unique in that it was like a civil war was taking place at the same time the revolution was taking place. Because other than Guilford Courthouse, there's not much activity that gets associated with the larger war. Well, there are others right around Alamance County.
The mill where Harmon Cox hung out. I mean, Fanning stayed there. Our family, we own that site.
Okay.
Our family has, through the years, said that somehow Fanning's mother and Harmon's wife were related in some way.
Interesting.
And that's, we don't know exactly how or what, but that's the story we get. And,
Yeah.
Harmon went to the Battle of Alamance. He got a pardon and came home, and my mother always said it's because there were 2 mills on that site. William Cox's 2 sons, Harmon and Thomas, had mills across the river. And the reason they had 2 mills was because the river got up a lot, and it flooded, and so they couldn't get their flour ground. So Harmon built one on this side of our side of the river.
And that, which is your side? East or west?
Ours is the east side.
East side.
Is that, ma'am, is that on Little River?
Is what?
Is that Little River?
Highway 22.
Deep
Is that
River.
Little River that goes down through there?
No, it's deeper.
Okay,
Deep River.
because where I stayed was Little River.
Yeah.
And one place was, on the back side of what we call Franklin Mountain, and the other is on the eastern bank of the Little
Yeah.
River.
Well, Thomas was on the west side, and like I said, the river still floods.
Oh, yeah.
And so, there's times you can't cross it. But,
But his wife was named Carr, right?
Her last name was Carr,
Carr.
and,
That ever show?
yeah, Sarah Carr.
I don't know, I have no idea.
Because there was one story was that, was her sister.
Yeah.
William Cox, the older's mother, was a Carr in Kennett Square, Queensmead, Pennsylvania. Thomas was my 5th great-grandfather, and William my 6th
Yeah,
great-grandfather.
well, see, Harmon was my great-grandfather back down the
Yeah.
line.
Might have solved it right here.
I haven't,
Yeah.
Harmon had been pardoned from hanging at the Battle of Alamance,
Yeah.
but it seems like there's an agreement that along Deep River for X miles, it's sort of like no man's land, there'll be no fighting, but we'll supply both sides. And I didn't know if the Coxes were just profiteers or good pacifists.
I think they were
But-
Quakers and supposedly pacifists. And
Till the 3rd time you tax them the same year.
Harmon kind of got tossed out because
Yeah.
he carried a pistol. Quakers didn't allow that.
Yeah, there's a story in Revolutionary Incidents, Volume 1 and 2 are great reads for this time period that I skipped over, but that recounts the story of some Quakers encountered by Colonel Washington, who they thought, this is after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, and they think that he's British, and so they say that they're on their way to go give their congratulations to Cornwallis, that they've heard he's camping near Bell's Mill, and these are Quakers from like the Back Creek area in Caraway, and he eventually reveals his identity, and it said he takes them, makes them trade horses, he takes their clothes, and then he disguises some of his men as Quakers. But anyway, so that was sort of the part. I mean, I have primarily Quaker ancestry, and the slide about their unique role maybe playing a bit to both sides, or just trying to remain peaceful as they could.
But they were also targeted because
Oh, yes.
they did not get involved.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
I've also seen a reference on a 1800s map to a Fanning's Rock and Cave down on Richland Creek, just north of Deep River. I don't know what that landmark would be or what that represents.
I don't think anyone's sure, correct? It's just placed on the map. Fanning's Rock and Cave, yeah.
Yeah, I
Just, yeah, placed on the map, not.
People used to know where it is, there was a lot of talk about it in, like the newspapers in the early 20th century, but nobody really knows.
Okay.
I have a question about, Colonel Balfour and where he was killed. Because I had heard stories, and somewhere I had read that he was killed at the base of Sheepskin Ridge, and then Fanny went to his house, raped and killed his sister.
Most of the story agrees that it was at his house, and like his sister's letter, Margaret, who was living with him, they're at home. In the story that he's reading the Bible, they're probably preparing to go attend service, or else maybe just return from service somewhere. That he's reading the Bible on his porch, so preparing, and also that all of the slaves were not at home, so it took place there, because she spells that out in the letter that.
And this is out at the airport?
Mm-hmm. Just near the airport, yeah. Thank you all for attending tonight.